There is a new scramble for Africa, and one of the old players in the game is changing its strategy of engagement. How can Africa benefit from all those extending a hand of friendship? And from a continental conversation, we focus on South Africa. The country could be in for a rough day as organized labor has given government a strike notice. And there are some changes coming to other places and parts of the continent. We have the latest on all of this and more on today's show. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun. Senegal is positioning itself as an alternative source of gas for Europe as Russia cuts supplies of the fuel. Before the Russia-Ukraine crisis, Russia provided as much as 40% of Europe's gas needs. Mamoudou Fall-Kane, the Deputy Permanent Secretary of Coal's Petrogas, a government committee that monitors and develops oil and gas projects, says Senegal will be able to sell its quota to Europe, especially Germany, in the second half of 2024. The country is projecting $1.4 billion of oil and gas revenues from 2023 to 2025 based on the benchmark price of $90 per barrel. OPEC says that in June 2022, Nigeria's crude oil production fell by 6,000 barrels per day to 1.17 million barrels per day in July 2022, down from 1.18 million barrels per day. Crude production fell to 752,000 barrels per day in the second quarter of 2022 from 1.06 million in the first quarter of the year. Nigeria produced 1.1 million barrels per day in Q4 of 2021. However, OPEC's direct communication figures show that Nigeria had lowered its production by 74,000 barrels per day to 1.08 million last month. Quarter on quarter, production was down 1.13 million from 1.29 million. Ethiopia has opened the Dari Dawa Free Trade Zone, the country's first free trade zone that seeks to enable competition with the global trade system. The government says the free trade zone would augment the country's economy by improving its import and export trade. The Dari Dawa Industrial Park and the dry port, along with the Ethiopia-Djibouti railway station, form the free trade zone. And in Egypt, Suez Customs collected 3.54 billion Egyptian pounds in taxes, custom duties, and other charges during July 2022. The total value of taxes and customs duties collected for imported goods stood at 901.73 million Egyptian pounds in July. The value-added tax came in at 2.33 billion Egyptian pounds last July, while other charges imposed on such goods totaled 286.82 million Egyptian pounds. The imported goods include strategic commodities, production inputs, and general cargo. And those are a few business headlines for you, African business headlines to get the show started. We'll take a quick time out. When we come back, a new game, an old player, or is it a new player and a new game? We'll tell you all about that after this. The 2007 to 2009 global recession brought many changes to the world's economy. Output slowed, unemployment rose, and financial institutions all over the world wrestled with the threat of imminent collapse. The crisis started in the United States and spread outwards. That is why it wasn't surprising that the country's trade with Africa suffered, slipping below China in 2009. But this looks set to change. Recently, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited South Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda. During this trip, he unveiled the U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, a document that lays out plans to strengthen trade, commercial ties, advance pandemic recovery, and economic opportunity. If successful, the U.S. looks to overtake China as Africa's leading development partner. However, much of the U.S. promises remain on paper, with little or no deals on the table so far. Dr. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist at PwC Nigeria, joins me now to look at how the new strategy could play out for the continent. Dr. Andrew Nevin, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's always a great pleasure to be with you, Total Love. I mean, your show, Business Edge, is fantastic. So thank you for all that you do for the
And we appreciate that feedback. So let's look at this. Many people were quite interested in the visit of the U.S. Secretary of State to the continent. And when it became very obvious that it was more than just let's get to know each other, there was an attempt to sort of reestablish and establish old ties and new ties as it may be. So the document starts off noting that the U.S. approach, some of the U.S.'s approach to Africa have been insufficient and commits the U.S. to reset its relations with African counterparts and listen to diverse local voices. So let's start with that. What's been wrong with how the U.S. has engaged Africa over the past several years and decades, particularly in the areas of business and trade?
Well, I mean, if we go back into the recent history, of course, under the Trump administration, there really wasn't any attention paid to Africa. I think by that last decade, 2010s, people realized the criticality of Africa in the world. But then when we rotated out of Barack Obama to the Trump presidency, that just got lost. So I think it was really important for the United States to do a refresh for the strategy. I think what's really good about the strategy, if you read it, is it's aligned with what Africa needs and actually wants itself. I mean, I think before the strategies were not really taking into account Africa was treated like a junior partner, a very junior partner on it. But if you look at the things that now the United States, so they're putting four things forward. One is just foster open societies. The second one is like build democratic institutions and better security apparatus. The third one is focused on economic opportunities, but not just in terms of GDP growth, but across the board for all of society, and of course include groups that have up to date been marginalized, youth and women. And the fourth part of the strategy, which I think is really critical, is helping Africa to address climate change and climate resiliency. And the U.S. used a term that's really important to Africa, which is climate justice. So as we make this transition to a low carbon world, how does Africa get treated properly? We didn't cause the climate crisis. We're suffering from it. People are telling us not to sell our fossil fuels like natural gas. You were just discussing Senegal's strategy on that. So I think it's a very good strategy. And I have faith the United States is on the right path with this.
So I have to follow up with this because while you say you think it's a good strategy, you did mention the fact, of course, coming out of the Obama years into the Trump years, Africa just got lost. And Biden right now has just about 2 years left on his administration. There are rumors that Trump may try to come back running again as U.S. president, but things are up in the air with how long or how much time the Biden administration really has to put this strategy into play. And then also questions about whether the next administration will continue this or then reintroduce another strategy. So what do you think about that in terms of the concerns for longevity in this and really making sure that the points you noted, I think about 4 pillars, are actually successful into the years to come and the decades to come as well?
Well, no one can predict the political future for the United States, but I mean, there is quite a lot of resiliency in the system. Once these things get baked in, the administration, you as president don't have unlimited power to shift it. But I think the world is moving towards these things. I mean, so when you look at the language of the strategy, like gender equality, sustainable development goals from the UN being at the center of the strategy, open societies and democracy, climate change, climate resiliency, climate justice. I mean, these are all things that certainly in most countries around the world, not all, but in most countries, the young people embrace all of these things. So I don't think necessarily one political office in the United States can necessarily stop the kind of march of history. I mean, we need these things to come into fruition. So I think it's a strategy whose time has come. I think it'll be hard to reverse. I mean, as we look at the events in climate change, and of course, this is affecting every country. I mean, we know the challenges here, the flooding in Lagos, for example, and other parts of the country on that. But when you look at the heat wave in China right now, the heat wave, the wildfires in Europe, the heat wave and the droughts in the United States, droughts in the United Kingdom, record temperatures. I mean, I don't think we're going to go back on being able to address the climate issues, even if the President Trump comes back in 2024.
All right, so let's look at one of the challenges the U.S. may have, and that would be possibly just to show follow through with some of the commitments that it has already made. Now, these include a pledge of about $200 billion over the next 5 years as part of the G7's plan to mobilize more money for global infrastructure. There's also a plan to invest around $11 billion over 5 years with countries, 16 of them in the continent, working with food security, agriculture, supply chains. So, in the context of the changing U.S. approach to the continent, how important is it for the U.S. to fulfill these pledges now and really show that it's more than just words on paper and more than just handshakes and signatures at international events?
Well, I think that's a challenge. So just to put some numbers on it, the United States the aid to, let's call it investment and aid, but from the U.S. government into Nigeria is about $1 billion a year. Into the continent of Africa is about $5 billion a year. That sounds like a large amount of money, but it's not sufficient, particularly given the just transition, the just energy transition that needs to be made. So the G7's made these pledges, and they haven't really fulfilled them on that. And I think part of the issue is having projects that can absorb that amount of capital. So we talk about that amount of capital being deployed, but it's not easy to spend billions of dollars productively. It's easy to spend billions of dollars and waste that. So I think there's a responsibility we have in Nigeria and across Africa to create more climate resiliency projects that can, so whether it's solar, whether it's water projects, sanitation, all of these things. I mean, I am one of the founding governors of the Financial Center for Sustainability Lagos, which was really driven by the CEO of FMDQ, and the vice chairman of it is Professor Doyin Salami, the chief economist of Nigeria. And we've taken a number of years to figure out how to create projects that you can start to absorb this kind of capital. So I think that the projects are coming along, and now we'll be able to absorb it. Whether the countries come up with the money, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure the United States will, and I'm pretty sure Europe will. I think the country that is making commitments is going to have the most trouble, perhaps, is the United Kingdom, which is really in a very difficult financial position. But I was last month, July 1st, there was a conference in Lagos led by the EU ambassador to Nigeria, where the EU countries pledged over $1 billion to strengthen the agricultural supply chain in Nigeria. Some of the major European companies like Arla, who already are very active for decades in this country, are part of the group that are driving these projects. So I think that the ability to absorb these large amounts of capital is there. And as I said, certainly from the United States viewpoint and from the EU viewpoint, I think they have the capital. As I said, I'm a little more concerned about the United Kingdom given their challenges.
Okay, so you've mentioned the issue around climate change and the energy transition twice now. So let's get into that because I do have some questions. And we've seen that the Biden administration has really been a country championing that, signing the U.S. back up with the Paris Accord as it may be. And we expect, given some of the wordings and the phrases and the terminology inside the document, that the new U.S.-Africa partnership should help Africa improve its energy generation. So you've mentioned climate justice. I've heard from the African Development Bank president that it's a just transition. That's the terminology being used there. But do you foresee this transition, backed not just by the U.S. but others, being just for the continent, especially with a new strategy to engage, a new strategy to help the economy, all of that, given the fact that Africa continues to have valuable, economically profitable natural resources in the ground, but the world is saying it's moving away from those type of resources?
Well, I think first, I mean, there's a few dimensions to climate justice. I mean, one dimension, of course, is compensating Africa for the fact it didn't actually cause the climate emergency, but suffers from it. And that's now become a mainstream discussion. So I think that's progress from a decade ago. And then the other issue that you raise, of course, is can we sell our fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, which is, I think, in my personal view, a transition fuel that should be exploited. I'm not sure we should be making more coal or producing more crude oil, but certainly natural gas, in my view, has a place. So both of those angles are important. In terms of being able to get, in a sense, reparations for not having damaged the climate, but suffering the damage, I'm not sure we'll get anywhere near the numbers. I mean, I think I've read numbers, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars when calculated properly. But I do think there will be a willingness on the major economies, developed economies, to invest in our own climate resiliency as we create projects that do that. And of course, if we start to have carbon credits I mean, my understanding of it is that producing these carbon credits in a Nigeria or African context is a lot less expensive than it is to produce the carbon credits in other places, which means that we can actually profit from it. So we can set up projects here that create carbon credits and get compensated for it well in excess of the cost of it. And that may end up being a really big source of revenue. Certainly at the Financial Center for Sustainability Lagos, our group thinks it is. In terms of being able to use our fossil fuels and in effect displace others from using them who have traditionally been able to sell them, I was very concerned of that. But of course, the Russia-Ukraine war changes everything. I mean, one of the things I came out in February, just days after the invasion, when I was on television, I said, look, this is an opportunity for us to really grow our gas reserves, so our gas production, and export it. And of course, what happened was, I think it was in 2019 or 2020, the federal government of Nigeria, rightfully so, said, we're not an oil nation, we're a gas nation. But the problem with that proclamation is it may have come too late because, of course, Europe had already, EU in particular, had already gone and said that they didn't want gas in this energy transition. They wanted to move as quickly as possible away. But the Ukrainian invasion has changed all that because all of a sudden the EU recognizes it can't move away from gas that quickly. Incredibly vulnerable, 40% of its gas coming from from Russia, as you say. So, I came out back at the end of February and said we need to ramp up gas production. The problem in Nigeria is most of our gas, and it's been very successful, NLNG, which is very difficult to pronounce, but it's been one of the most successful companies in the country. It's owned 51% by NNPC, 49% by Total, Eni, and Shell, I believe. And it's worked very well for the nation. It's got up to Train 7. The problem for gas in this country is that most of the gas that we produce is what's called associated gas, which means it's produced in conjunction with oil. So we don't have separate gas production. Well, when the oil production drops, as we've seen because of violence and vandalism and theft, the gas production also drops. But we really need an urgent focus on creating non-associated gas that we can export to Europe. And I think now with with the invasion of the Ukraine, Europe will be willing to accept the gas and want Nigerian gas.
All right. Andrew, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, I want to look at some of the criticism that this is more a response to the rising influence of China and Russia than it is really the fact that the U.S. now sees the continent as a viable economic and trade partner. We'll look at that. And then, of course, what happens in the intervening years when we look at a number of issues? How does Africa make sure we gain? Is it a collective bargaining strategy, or is it going to be every country for itself? We're going to continue this conversation just after the break, looking at the new U.S.-Africa strategy as announced by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on a recent trip to the continent. Do stick around. Critics say that the new U.S.-Africa strategy, which says it will widen the circle of engagement and elevate African leadership to advance a shared agenda, as well as those announced by the European Union in recent times, are simply attempts to remove China as Africa's chief development partner. And the U.S. has been vocal in its concern for the rising influence of China and Russia on the continent. Now, still with me is Dr. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist at PwC Nigeria, as we look at this new approach to engaging the continent from the U.S. So, Dr. Nevin, my question here is, do you really see this as the U.S. ready to work with Africa in a different way, or does this just continue to be a chess game where, unfortunately, the continent is a pawn between those who want to be the global superpowers?
Well, I think it's both, at the end of the day. I mean, I think, I don't know what's in the president's head in the United States or Secretary Blinken's head, but I mean, I do think there's a genuine sense that the United States wants to work with the continent and the EU. I mean, all my work here, a lot of it with the EU countries, genuinely want to work with Africa. But of course, it also has to be a response to some of the geopolitical events that we've had. I mean, I have to say from a personal viewpoint, I mean, I lived in China for 10 years. I went there first in 1983. I went to the Soviet Union first in 1983. I was, when I was young, I mean, I was optimistic, as many young people are, that over time the world would become a more peaceful place. In many ways it has. But, recent events have really shown us we have a long way to go. And there is, of course, this rivalry. And I think, Africa needs to tread its way through. What I've said before is that, Africa should seek to have economic and social and commercial relationships, diplomatic political relationships, around the world. It shouldn't be necessarily choosing sides. But I have to say, with the way that events have happened over the last little while, with what the Chinese have done and the belligerence of the Chinese vis-a-vis Taiwan, what's happened in Hong Kong, what happens in Xinjiang, despite having lived there for 10 years and speaking the language, I have a very negative feeling about China right now. And I'm not sure you say the biggest development partner in this continent, yes, in terms of investment, but the investment all comes with loans. We know now there's tremendous pressure. Sometimes the projects don't quite deliver the returns that were expected. The Chinese expect to be paid back their money, so it's putting pressure on a lot of countries. And we have the other issue, which we have to be honest about, is the Chinese racism in Africa. We've all heard the stories about videos made of Africans, including children, that are sold for profit in China, which are horribly racist. And I'm not sure that makes the best partner for Nigeria or for the African continent. In terms of Russian involvement in Africa, I mean, I said before that the United States has about, I think, $5 billion private sector investment in Nigeria, and has $1 billion of U.S. government money put in every year. As far as I can tell, the Russians, they don't have any economic resources to bring to the continent. All they're bringing to the continent, here by the reports, is mayhem, backing mercenaries, working with fragile states. I mean, they're close, Egypt, with dictatorships. If you go back to the core of the United States opening paragraph, I mean, their opening strategy, the pillar one, I mean, it's all about open society, it's about democracy, it's about building that, and that's not an easy thing to do, and it's very messy, as we know in Nigeria. But in Nigeria, we've had a peaceful transition of power a number of times over the last, since democracy came back in 1999. It's an open society, not perfect, but with a very vibrant press and debate in this country. Is that something that we want to turn our backs on in terms of being closer to China, being closer to Russia, both of which are not open societies? So yeah, it's complex. But I think the United States and Europe and also India. So I yesterday was at India Independence Day yesterday at the High Commission here in Abuja. It was a fantastic event. India is 76 years since independence. Nigeria is coming up, I think, to 61 or 62. I mean, there's a lot in common between Nigeria and India. We just put out a paper on that. I mean, India is an open society. Yes, it's imperfect, it's complex, there's still many challenges to go through, but from where I sit in my long experience in this world, I'd much rather live in an open society like Nigeria, India, Europe, the United States, than in a society right now like Russia or China.
Now, some would say this plan and others tend to treat Africa as a country. With 54 countries, it is not. This is a fairly large continent, very diverse as it may be. But we've seen now the new U.S.-Africa partnership. We've seen the China-Africa summit. We've seen the Russia-Africa summit. We've seen the France-Africa summit, the Turkey-Africa summit. Everybody's coming to the continent in a way. You're laughing, extending their hands. But the question has to be now, how do we make sure we gain the most from this? This is the new and possibly the last scramble for the continent. Are we looking at collective bargaining, which Africa has not been very good at? Or do you think this is a situation where countries will have to make the best deal possible for themselves, their economies, and their citizens with everyone who's coming to the continent?
Well, again, a little bit like my previous answer, I think a bit of both. I mean, I think that the AFCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, is an incredible achievement. I mean, to bring the countries together in that way and the commitment to it. And of course, again, this is a work in progress. I mean, the AFCFTA is part of the Africa Union's 50-year plan for Africa. So the plan was launched in 2013, a plan out to 2063. So we're just right at the beginning of AFCFTA. But I think it's important. If you think about a trading bloc, it then presents a unified view to the outside world. So if we take the EU, so the UK chooses to leave the European Union, and then they're surprised when they're told they have to follow to export to any country, they have to follow the rules of the EU working as a bloc. So I think not AFDB, they're central to all of this, but Africa, particularly the African Union from a political viewpoint, has to make sure that with AFCFTA, we present a united bloc. But at the same time, I mean, one of the really powerful things that's happening in Africa right now is the diaspora. I mean, we wrote the paper about the economic power. It's not just the economic power, it's the linkage power. So you think about who are the natural partners for Africa. Well, one thing that makes you a natural partner is that you have a lot of the diaspora, because you have people that can link the countries together, make sure there's trade and investment flows, there's human ties, there's educational ties, there's cultural ties on that. So where's the big diaspora from Africa? Well, obviously the United States has an enormous diaspora from every country. Canada, which is my home country, has a huge African diaspora, particularly though from Francophone Africa, many, many ties. Europe and the United Kingdom have huge diasporas as well. So that really helps to make the country-to-country connections there, country-to-country connectivity. But I don't think we should, as President, go out and compete. African countries shouldn't be competing with each other in terms of these relationships and trading off in a race to the bottom. We need to use the AFCFTA to present that united front, just the same way EU does, or NAFTA does, which is the free trade agreement between the three countries in North America. Africa needs to be united. But I think there's a willingness to do that, and I really salute the political leaders who, across Africa, who've been at this spearheaded kind of this new Africa movement in effect. And hopefully we'll continue to support each other to make sure that you don't get that divide and conquer strategy from other countries or other regions that impoverishes the continent.
And I think that's an excellent note to end this conversation on. We're going to be watching. There's a lot of development in this regard, and people want to see it move from a strategy and a document on paper to action on the ground for African economies and, of course, for Africa's people. Dr. Andrew Nevin, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me.
You're very welcome, Tololokwe. It's wonderful to be with you.
All right. And this new strategy does really show the potential for the U.S. and Africa's relationship. But we also have to remember that it's not just an economic relationship as well. It's also political. And there are some U.S. cultural stance that simply are not tolerated on the continent. Could those be a barrier to the furtherance of this relationship? Time is what they say will tell. And many of us will be watching to see how these relationships develop over time. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, probably just a very short break. We'll bring international business, and from there we head to South Africa. It could be the mother of all one-day strikes in just about 8 days. We have the details.